Reducing competition. As scientific medicine won public and professional credibility, it also solved the second and fundamentally more serious problem facing the profession in the 19th century: competition. Plagued by competition among numerous medical sects, between practitioners and medical school faculty, and within crowded ranks of regular practitioners themselves, the profession was saved from its own internal competitive struggles by the triumph of scientific medicine. First, the technical requirements of teaching scientific medicine provided several advantages for the profession's elite. Second, scientific medicine forged new unity in the interest of elite practitioners and medical school faculty. Third, as it gained increasingly widespread legitimacy, scientific medicine undermined the major medical sects. It thereby imposed unity among those sects in their subordination to the dominant forces in the profession. And finally, medical science made possible specialization, which was largely a response to competition within medicine. The overall impact of scientific medicine within the profession was to legitimize control by elite practitioners and medical school faculty. Technical requirements of scientific medical education. The new academicians. Making the doctor the purveyor of a broad range of skills within a context of mystified knowledge required extensive and esoteric training. 19th century medical reformers envisioned the physician as a bedside scientist. Medical practitioners must think and talk like scientists. They must be trained in anatomy, physiology, bacteriology, pathology, pharmacology, and the physical sciences. They must think of health and disease not holistically as general relationships, but bodily systems or between the person and the environment, but in terms of the micro concepts of physiology and anatomy, bacteriology, and cell pathology. These sciences and their reductionist concepts were gradually recognized in the late 19th century as the foundations of medical education. The medical schools of the last century were staffed by practitioners, often very talented men who were heavy on the art but less expert on the science. Increasingly, laboratory science courses were taken away from the local practitioner and given to the physicians with special training in the laboratory sciences. The new academic physicians who preferred these laboratory sciences over medical practice prospered with the increased demand for more faculty with training in these fields. Those who could afford to spend a year or two studying in Germany or Austria after medical school had secure, if not lucrative, academic careers awaiting them on their return. In 1893, Johns Hopkins became the first medical school in the United States to employ these laboratory men full-time and pay them salaries that enabled them to devote all their time and energy to research and teaching. The new full-time organization of laboratory science faculty was hailed as a great advance for American medical education. It was quickly adopted by other elite schools and gradually became the norm, emulated by the average institution. Although the laboratory science faculty gave up private practice incomes of $10,000 a year and more in return for salaries of $3,000 or $4,000, there were more than enough people to fill the demand. Some of the giants of medical reform, like William H. Welch, loathed medical practice, feared the insecurity of competition among private practitioners, and longed for the opportunity to pursue medical research without the diversions of maintaining a private clientele. Before going off to Europe in 1876 to advance his medical science skills, Welch confided to his sister his fears of trying to set up by hook or by crook a patronage of some kind. Echoing the pipe dreams of most medical graduates, Welch observed, "It is much finer to hold a chair in a medical college and to have a salary, and to be sought by patients instead of seeking them." His studies abroad would give him a jump on his competitors. "If by absorbing a little German lore I can get a little start of a few thousand rivals, and thereby reduce my competitors to a few hundred more or less, it is a good point to tally." The emphasis on scientific medicine thus created unprecedented job opportunities for physicians and medical scientists. As positions expanded, a core of professionals developed who were more dedicated than ever to seeing medicine as science completely displaced medicine as art. The medical scientists' interest and identification were bound up solely with medical schools and not with private practice. As the vanguard of the profession's successful strategy and the recipients of millions of dollars in capital investments in medical research and education, the new medical academicians became the symbol of the new profession. In the 1890s, for the first time in the United States, the profession came to exalt the scientist over the practitioner. Despite their more modest middle-class incomes, the scientists were the new elite in the profession. The faculty at the most prestigious schools won their professional reputations on the basis of their research contributions to their fields. The best reputations attracted the best students and the wealthiest patients. In 1903, William Halsted, a famous surgeon of Johns Hopkins faculty, got $10,000 for an appendectomy of his colleague, Howard Kelly, who charged $20,000 for a major operation. Unlike the old-time medical faculties, whose material interests were enhanced by student fees and referrals from their many former students, the new academicians' material interests were tied to the promotion of medical science. It was in their interest to raise the standards of the medical schools and to make scientific medicine the only acceptable theory and practice. The predominant type of medical school, owned by the faculty and existing on student fees, prospered as long as enrollments could be kept high and costs low. However, practitioners would prosper only if the production of physicians were decreased, reducing competition within the profession. This conflict of economic interest had divided elite practitioners from medical school faculty throughout the 19th century. The ascendancy of scientific medicine transformed the old conflict into the basis for an alliance between the scientific medical faculties and the elite practitioners. The interests of the new medical scientists in medical education were thus tied to the dominance of the scientific medicine and not to large numbers of students or even large numbers of medical schools. They joined the elite practitioners as the leaders of the reform in the profession. Together, they gained control of the AMA at the turn of the century and completely reorganized it to make the AMA the profession's instrument of political action as we know it today, and to use it and the leading medical schools to alter completely the technical, economic, and social forces within the medical profession. The technical requirements of developing and teaching scientific medicine sharpened the distinction between laboratory science, faculty, and practitioners, provided new and expanding job opportunities for medical scientists, and hoisted them to elite and influential positions within the profession. At the same time, these developments provided the basis for the alliance between the new elite faculty and the elite practitioners, giving them sufficient power to take control of the profession and transform it. Fewer and better. As a professional consensus developed around scientific medicine, the scientific medical faculty and elite practitioners agreed upon objective criteria for judging medical schools. The needs of scientific medical education were pretty clear-cut. If students are to be trained as medical scientists, they need to be taught the biological and physical sciences, and they need to be taught how to apply the principles they learn in those sciences to the diseases of real people. Experience, as well as common sense, argued for laboratory courses in these sciences and hospital experience for the clinical application of those sciences. Learning how is at least as important as learning about. The technical requirements of teaching scientific medicine suggest fairly clear criteria for judging medical schools. If the premise of training scientists is accepted, then any worthy medical program must have adequate laboratory facilities, clinical teaching facilities, and well-trained laboratory and clinical faculty. While the criteria of what is adequate might be and were argued the standards were set by those who secured positions of power, the AMA became the vehicle for political action within the profession and larger society. The reformers used the technical requirements of training medical scientists to set standards and then evaluate medical schools according to those standards. With a few exceptions, Johns Hopkins, the shining example among them, virtually all 19th century medical colleges were weak when judged by these standards. Unquestionably, scientific medical education was and is an expensive affair. The capital outlays for laboratories and hospital faculties were beyond the resources of most 19th century and early 20th century medical schools. Student lecture fees could not cover the larger salaries for faculty who devoted substantial time to research and teaching, let alone the increasingly widespread full-time salaries for laboratory science faculty. No medical school could exist on student fees and at the same time provide these increasingly necessary medical science programs for their students. In some states, students who graduated from medical colleges that did not have these programs, faculties, and personnel were barred from taking licensing examinations. Increasingly, state exams were geared to the information and perspectives provided in scientifically oriented schools, and graduates of inadequately equipped schools failed to their licensing exams with increasing frequency. Since the schools were supported by students' fees and had little incentive to attend a school that did not prepare them to pass state board exams, inadequate schools lost out in the competitive market for enrollees and their money. AMA President Charles Reed observed in 1901, "Under the pressure of legal requirements, the weight falls with almost fatal force upon the small, private, and poorly equipped institutions. The technical requirements of scientific medical education thus brought about the conditions of collapse of proprietary medical schools," as Abraham Flexner later noted. "Nothing has perhaps done more to complete the discredit of commercialism than the fact that it has ceased to pay. It is but a short step from an annual deficit to the conclusion that the whole thing is wrong anyway." In Chapter 4, we will see how these conditions provided an opportunity for the AMA and capitalist foundations to transform medical education in the United States. For the moment, it is enough to note that without sufficient capital and endowments, no medical school could survive in the era of scientific medicine. Schools collapsed and consolidated all over the country beginning in 1905, coinciding with the first year of serious activity by the AMA's new Council on Medical Education. Between 1905 and 1910, 30 schools merged and 21 closed down altogether. The number of medical schools declined from a high of 166 in 1904 to 133 in 1910, 104 in 1915, and hit a low of 76 in 1929. In the reorganization of medical schools, the number of students was reduced at many institutions in order to intensify the teaching and research resources within each school. Thus, the technical requirements of scientific medical education were used to close schools and decrease the production of new physicians, easing the competition within the profession and raising doctors' incomes. Furthermore, scientific medical education required great preliminary education. Students must come to medical school, it was argued, having had a full year each of college chemistry, physics, and biology. The demands for stringent requirements of preliminary education were not new to the era of scientific medicine. In 18th century and 19th century England, where physicians were a tiny elite above surgeons and apothecaries, it was essential for physicians to be regarded as gentlemen. Besides, they practiced only among the wealthy. It was important to their pocketbooks to be able to mingle with the upper class. As professions developed, a liberal education became the mark of the upper class origins. "It might not make you a gentleman," W.J. Reeder had observed, "but without it, a gentleman you could hardly hope to be." In the United States as well, a college education was the mark of a gentleman. For those who were not born into privileged class, a college education, if it could be gotten, rubbed the raw edge off many a country boy, giving them sufficiently proper appearances to make their way to a higher social class. It is not surprising, then, that substantial educational requirements had been declared an imperative in the mid-19th century because it would assure that doctors would be gentlemen. Daniel Drake, probably the most illustrious American physician of the mid-century, criticized his colleagues' ignorance of Latin and Greek, without which, whatever may be his genius and professional skill, a physician would still necessarily appear defective and uncultivated. This persistent concern was echoed by John Hopkins' famous Dr. Welch, who wrote in 1906, "The social position of a medical man and his influence on the community depend to a considerable extent upon his preliminary education and general culture." Elite physicians frequently complained of the coarse and common fiber of much of the profession. Even a minority of the profession lacking upper-class polish cheapened the status of all doctors. The proliferation of inexpensive proprietary schools enabled a young man to live at home while attending medical school, and thereby made medicine a ladder that some farm boys, artisans, and shop clerks could climb to middle-class status and income. It was not only the inadequacies in the training provided in commercial colleges that angered the elite reformers. It was also whom they brought into the profession. Frank Billings, in his presidential address to the AMA in 1903, disdained these sundown institutions that provided evening classes that enabled the clerk, the streetcar conductor, the janitor, and others employed during the day to earn a degree. Prior to the acceptance of scientific medicine, attempts to lengthen the medical school term of instruction and raise preliminary education requirements were met with charges of elitism. There is an aristocratic feature in this movement by medical societies. Martin Payne, a faculty member in the New York University Medical Department, asserted in 1846, "It is oppression towards the poor for the sake of the crippling the medical colleges." Even after the turn of the century, some education leaders warned against excluding the poor from medicine. In 1908, W.L. Bryan, president of Indiana University, criticized the Association of American Medical Colleges' proposed requirement of 2 years attendance at a liberal arts college prior to admission. Raising the entrance requirement would shut out of the medical schools thousands of men who are not ignorant nor incompetent, but who would be excluded because poverty and other hard conditions have kept them from the colleges. The profession's objective was exactly that, to exclude the poor classes from their ranks. Scientific medicine provided an objective basis for the requiring of lengthy preliminary education. If students had to come prepared with college courses in physics, chemistry, and biology, then there could be no argument against lengthening the requirements. The standard-setting schools raised their requirements from completion of high school to 2 years of liberal arts college and finally to a bachelor's degree. From the moment it opened its doors in 1893, Johns Hopkins Medical School led the way by requiring a bachelor's degree for admission and 4 years of instruction for the prestigious MD degree. When Harvard instituted a bachelorette requirement in 1901, its entering medical class dropped from an all-time high of 198 students the previous year to 67. The preliminary education requirements were several steps ahead of the great majority of American youth and enabled the profession to draw its recruits from the better classes. Was this an unintended outcome of the technical requirements of medical education, or was it the desired outcome for which scientific medicine provided mere rationale? Given the goals of professional leaders throughout the 19th century, to reduce the numbers of physicians and to raise the social class standing of the profession, it seems that scientific medicine provided the credible rationale that all previous generations of medical elites had sought in vain. The preliminary requirement would weed out the economically and socially unfit. Some reformers justified this selectivity by the cost of scientific medical education. "It does not pay to give $5,000 education to a $5 boy," intoned John Shaw Billings in 1886 while helping to organize Johns Hopkins medical training. But most elite physicians simply desired to eliminate professional degeneracy, as Dr. Inez Philbrick put it at the turn of the century. Philbrick, a successful practitioner in Lincoln, Nebraska, rallied his colleagues to "let fewer and better be our motto." In sum, the technical requirements of scientific medical education gave a new career opportunity to physicians as medical scientists, creating a whole new position of full-time researcher and teachers and a new group of elite medical school faculty who combined a material interest in medical schools with a commitment to promoting scientific medicine. At the same time, these technical requirements of the new medical education provided the standards and rationale for reducing output of medical schools and raising the social class base of the entire profession.